Members of a House Homeland Security Committee task force held a press conference Tuesday about a report investigating terrorists and foreign fighters traveling to Syria to join ISIS. This is 40 Minutes.
You can balance the height differential. Good morning. I want to thank everybody for being here today. I also want to thank the ranking member, Benny Thompson, for working with me in a bipartisan fashion. I want to thank all the members of the task force in creating a bipartisan report on combating terrorism and foreign fighters. In my judgment, the threat to the homeland has never been greater. This is a product of ISIS growing in the region, in Iraq and Syria. There's a threat of foreign fighters traveling to the region and then coming back to Europe or to the United States. We've had over 30,000 foreign fighters from 100 different countries travel to what is called the Caliphate to fight. We've had 5,000 individuals with Western passports, so that's of great concern when it comes to visa waiver countries. We've had over 250 Americans travel from the United States to the region, many of whom have returned to the United States. This threat, coupled with the threat over the internet that we have seen, which has evolved from bin Laden and caves and couriers, to now a new generation of terrorists using the internet to radicalize individuals within the United States. So this is a dual threat that we face. And again, the task force worked for 6 months, again in a bipartisan way, and the findings are concerning. The findings indicate that number one, the threat is getting worse, not better, that we are losing in this struggle to keep Americans from the battlefield, because many are still going to the region and coming back. And I think most importantly that we lack a national strategy to deal with this problem. We took a delegation to Europe to examine the problem, found that there were many security gaps with respect to travel from Iraq, Syria, through Turkey into Western Europe. For instance, they don't pass EU citizens past their watch lists. But the bottom line, I think, is that until we deal with the threat where it is, until we have a strategy to deal with the threat where it exists and eliminate that threat, we're going to continue to have this problem. And until we have a combating violent extremism effort in the United States to deal with radicalization from within, on the prevention side, we're going to continue to have a problem here in the United States. I think the stats are alarming. Over nearly 70 ISIS followers have been arrested in the last year in the United States of America. I think that's a wake-up call to action, and I think that's what this task force was formed to do, to create recommendations to deal with this alarming and increasing problem that we face here in the homeland. I am hopeful that we will produce legislation as a result of the key findings of this report from the task force. So with that, again, I want to thank all the members on both sides of the aisle for coming together, something you don't see very often in this Congress, working together, Democrat and Republican, to address a very, very serious issue. And with that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Benny Thompson.
Thank you, Chairman McCall. As the chairman stated, this is a bipartisan effort on behalf of the members of the Homeland Security Committee. The committee worked for about 6 months, but had a specific mission not to produce legislation, but to produce recommendations. They've worked hard. There's no question about the terrorist threat that we face. There's no question about Americans going to join ISIL and other foreign fighters abroad. But the question is whether or not we can determine that some of those people are trying to get back into the United States. They're getting here. So what we had to have was a bipartisan task force to look specifically at this issue. They produced a report. We're happy. Now I look forward to the bipartisan effort to produce legislation based on this report. The chairman is correct. This committee is one of few bipartisan committees here in this Congress. When bad people want to hurt Americans, they don't ask party, they don't ask anything, they just want to hurt Americans. So it's in that spirit that we offer this task force report, but more importantly, we look forward to working with meaningful legislation because of this task force. Thank you.
I want to thank the ranking member. And I want to echo those comments that terrorists don't check our party affiliation before they want to kill Americans. And so with that, I want to introduce the chairman of the task force, John Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Benny Thompson. One of the joys of working on Homeland Security is we're doing things that we're supposed to be doing in Congress. We see a problem, we attack the problem, and we try and find solutions for it. And I appreciate the chairman and Mr. Thompson for empowering us on the committee to do this job and to form this task force, and then just let us do our work. And a lot of work we did do. We had 16 member briefings and site visits. We had 29 staff briefings, and we traveled to 8 foreign countries. Some of the countries we traveled to, I'll highlight for a moment here. We sat across the table from Benjamin Netanyahu for 2 hours the day before he formed his cabinet, talking about the ISIS threat and the terrorist threat that he faces all around him. And it was very insightful. We then traveled to Baghdad, Iraq, right on the front lines, and got it from the leaders in Iraq as well as the military leaders in the United States that are advising Iraq. We went to Turkey to check how the flow of foreign fighters going through Turkey into Syria is happening and what they're doing about it, if anything. We then went to the Western European counterparts of ours to try and figure out why there's such gaping holes in security in Western Europe. And quite frankly, that's one of the alarming findings we had, is that hole is significant. There are about 5,000 Westerners at least, and I stress at least because we don't know what we don't know, but at least 5,000 Westerners have gone to join the fight in ISIS. Many of them are from Europe, the vast majority of them, and Europe has very relaxed travel standards, and they don't screen passengers the way we do. So it's much more difficult to determine if someone is actually going over to Turkey or to Syria to join the fight. So that's a huge problem for us, because when they come back from the fight, they may decide to come to the United States, radicalized. And since it's visa-free waiver countries, it's a real problem. And then, of course, you have the problem with the 250 known Americans that have traveled to the zone, or attempted to travel to the zone in the last year and a half, 2 years. And the number's gone up very significantly in the last year. Those individuals pose a huge threat to the United States in a couple of different ways. Number one, if they go there and they fight and come back home, they're radicalized and they're ticking time bombs for major incidents in the United States. Number two, they're recruiting others from the United States to come over and join the fight with them. And number three, they're helping to radicalize individuals over the internet in the United States. And with respect to radicalization over the internet, that poses probably the biggest problem for the United States, because it's that problem that is the most difficult thing, most taxing thing for our law enforcement officials here in the United States. We've had 60 some odd incidents, like the chairman has noted, in the last year and a half alone, of Americans that have been involved in ISIS-related incidents or planning ISIS-related attacks in the United States. That number is expected to grow. There's a lot of work we have to do going forward, and this report isn't just about finding the problems, it's about presenting solutions. 32 specific solutions in the reports, but let me tell you some of the general overviews of those solutions, or general issues we have to address. The gaping security loopholes in Europe is one of them. Trying to get the Europeans and our foreign counterparts throughout the world to work with us and have a centralized database for tracking these foreign fighter travelers. We got to focus on combating domestic radicalization in a huge way. We have to figure out how to provide off-ramps for individuals who are becoming radicalized, identifying them, doing the hard work on the community level. That's very difficult. We need to work on having a national strategy here. We don't have that. And we also need to figure out how to do a better job of identifying those individuals that are trying to go over to Europe. One of the other things we got to look at is the problem with how they're recruiting Americans here. They recruit them on the internet, and they go to what we call the dark spaces of the internet, which we can't monitor even with a court order. It's very difficult, and that's a real problem for us. And we got to figure out how to do a better job with that. We have to work with our global allies much better than we're doing right now, in much more coordinated fashion. And we got to encourage information sharing, which Mr. Loudermilk identified for us during the course of the task force, about information sharing between local, state, and federal officials, and doing a better job of that. There's many more things we have to do, but the bottom line is the recommendations are specific, and you're going to see a lot of proposed legislation coming out of this. We worked very hard on this, and I want to thank everybody involved in this. Mr. Vella did a great job on the Democratic side, and my Republican colleagues here, Mr. Ratcliffe, Ms. McSally, Mr. Loudermilk, and Mr. Hurd, all of us freshman congressmen, we all worked together, we did a good job, and they all brought different strengths to the table, and I think the report shows that we've done our homework. So again, I want to thank the chairman for allowing us to do this work, and thank all my colleagues for the great work they did on this. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you, Chairman Katko, for your hard work. Now recognize Congressman from Texas, Mr. Vella.
Thank you. I too want to thank Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Thompson for initiating this very important effort. And Chairman Katko took over this committee right after he came into Congress, and he really put his heart and soul. So I think on behalf of all our colleagues, I'd like to thank you, Congressman Katko, and the rest of my colleagues and committee staff who worked very hard over the last 6 months. I won't repeat a lot of it about what's already been said, but the thing here is that we're dealing with an enemy. People ordinarily want peace, but in this case, we're dealing with an enemy who wants to conquer and wants to cause a lot of harm. And what we found, the threat over the course of the last 6 months evolved almost before our very eyes, because the issue with internet radicalization popped up, and there for a period of time it was, things were happening all over the place. So the most important thing about this report is what it shows us is that we've got a whole lot more work to do so that we can confront this threat. And, hopefully we know our committee has come together in a bipartisan fashion, but this is an issue that should have no party lines, because this is an American issue. What we're talking about is safety to our people, and hopefully we can convince the rest of our colleagues to move forward together to confront this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Vella. Chair recognizes Mr. Hurd from Texas.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member Thompson, Chairman Katko. It was a pleasure working alongside with you. I spent over 9 years as an undercover officer in the CIA. I was a guy in the back alleys chasing Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and having seen enemies like that up close and personal, and seeing what ISIS has evolved into is scary. They're a clear and present danger to the United States, and we need to do everything we can to stop them in their tracks. Now, one of the shocking things for me, in a good way, was information sharing has improved since I joined the CIA back in 2000. That was good to see, but there's still a lot more work that can be done. The Chairman McCall and Chairman Katko alluded to our European partners need to do more in using the information that we're sharing with them. But one of the scary things about ISIS is their ability to leverage social media to get their message out. They're influencing and touching millions of people a day, and we need to be able to counter that message. And they're inspiring folks by saying, come to Syria for some adventure. But we need to get the message out that you're more likely to get a bomb dropped on your head than finding adventure in Syria. So our men and women on the ground are doing a great job, but we need to be a little bit more aggressive with our intelligence posture in Syria. So I'm looking forward to continuing the work of this committee and making sure we protect the men and women in the United States of America against this scourge. Thank you.
Hey, Congressman Hurd, Chair recognizes Congressman Loudermilk.
First of all, let me thank Chairman McCall and Congressman Katko for allowing me to be part of this extremely important task force. I think the work we were doing came to full recognition to us is that our major concern is terrorist attacks on American soil. While we were on our Middle Eastern and European trip was when the attack in Garland, Texas occurred. And it was a wake-up call to all of us how important it was what we were doing. Because we're talking about protecting Americans on American soil. When these foreign fighters, those that we know of, and more importantly, those we don't know of, come back here, they're looking to do attacks on American soil. One of the challenges we're looking at, how do we better protect Americans? How do we multiply our forces on the ground? We have better cooperation between the various law enforcement agencies than I think we've ever had in this country, but we still have a lot of improvement. The way we can have a force multiplier is better cooperation between our local law enforcement, our local first responders, and those federal agencies. We've made a lot of improvement there, but there's a lot more improvement that we can make as well. And that's one of the areas that I naturally focused up on, especially after hearing about the Garland, Texas attack, is how can we better improve? How do we integrate those local law enforcement who are already boots on the ground? They know their neighborhoods, they know their communities, and can provide intelligence to the federal government as well as the federal government use those resources better. We're going to be looking at how to better improve that. I think Georgia has done a very good job through their Fusion Center and cooperation, but we have still found ways that we can do that better. And again, thank you for allowing me to participate.
Thanks, Barry. Chair recognizes Joe from Arizona, Ms. McSally.
Thanks, Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, and Chairman Katko. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to be appointed to this task force, and the work we have done has been exactly what my freshman colleagues and I said we came here to do, which is solve problems, to protect America, and impact the future of our country as far as the security goes. Now, while Congressman Hurd was chasing guys around on the ground, I was shooting 30 millimeter out of A-10s against this kind of threat while I was serving in the Air Force for 26 years. And I'll tell you, this threat has grown and metastasized and is something that is much more nimble, and we've got to catch up. The terrorists are acting at the speed of broadband while we are acting at the speed of bureaucracy. And we talked about the numbers here today, but those are the numerator. We don't even know what the denominator is. And the federal agencies will tell you that there's so many unknowns. We don't know who's been radicalized and who's traveled and who's sitting at home right now getting radicalized on the internet. So this is a very serious and sophisticated threat, and we've got to be much more nimble and responsive. And I appreciate the work of this task force and the recommendations we have in order to move this forward. We've got to be doing a better job between us and our allies to address this threat and to be more nimble. We've got to be doing a better job within the agencies of our federal government. While we have 10,000 IRS agents that are making sure you don't take an improper home office deduction on your taxes, we have less than 24 individuals focusing on countering violent extremism and ideology in our federal government. That's not going to work for us. We need to step up our game. We need better information sharing and more flexibility and nimbleness to respond to this, and also between federal, state, and local officials and civil society, quite frankly. We got to step up and do this together, but we need a strategy, and a lot of these recommendations are going to address these shortfalls. So it's been an absolute honor to be here. We look forward to continuing to work to address this threat and keep America safe.
Chair now recognizes Congressman from Texas, Mr. Rycliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Prior to coming to Congress, I had the opportunity to serve as a terrorism prosecutor. In fact, I served by special appointment in the largest terrorism financing case in U.S. history, so I certainly know well the dangers of homegrown terrorism. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have served on this task force, but I think the main takeaway that we have to focus on here is the lack of a national strategy in combating foreign fighters and the vulnerabilities that that has created. It is my hope that our report, its findings, and its recommendations are not simply filed away, but become the foundation for a national strategy in dealing with this problem by both the executive branch and by the legislative branch. And I certainly intend to make it part of my focus and part of my mission as I go forward in Congress. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be on this task force, and I appreciate the leadership that all my colleagues have provided on this issue. Thank you.
Thanks. You know, people always ask me what keeps you up at night, and it's really the individual we don't know about. Now, we have a lot of good intelligence. I think the FBI and Homeland Security are doing a great job identifying the threat both abroad and within the United States. But it's a case we don't know about. The foreign fighter who traveled to Syria and came back to the United States that, as Chairman Katko said, is a ticking time bomb. It's a case of the individual radicalizing over the internet that at any moment could pop up and kill Americans. It's the Chattanooga case where we had no flags, we had no warnings, no warning signs that keeps me up at night. We have a lot of work to do, and I think this report will go a long ways towards protecting Americans here in the United States. We have to have a strategy to deal with this, both a military strategy abroad, a political solution, but also a prevention strategy here in the United States to stop this threat so that we can carry out the mission of this committee to protect the American people. And so with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. I believe J.J. Green with WTOP has the first. Yeah.
Thank you for doing the report, and thank you for granulating, crystallizing, maybe a better word, what we've been hearing for 3 or 4 years. We all know about this threat, and we all know about their nimble nature when it comes to using social media, and we all know just via the images that we've seen what they're capable of, and we all know that it's a big problem. So I wonder if you would give us an example of the number one thing that needs to be done that the American people can actually see some concrete results from immediately. So what is the one thing that, the top thing that can be done that will see some results immediately that you recommend?
Well, I don't think there's just one simple solution to this problem. I mean, as we traveled abroad to the Middle East, seeing the threat, we were in Baghdad a week before they took over Ramadi. Met Prime Minister Netanyahu, went into Europe. The security gaps that they have in foreign travel into Europe that can then get into the United States is a real threat. But as you mentioned, the radicalization over the internet, when you have 200,000 ISIS tweets per day going out to thousands of followers in the United States every day to kill military, to attack military installations, it's really hard to get around that from a security standpoint. We've done a pretty good job trying to stop that, but it's the internet capability that's very different from the days of bin Laden, where now you have this new generation that are very adept at social media. So I would say a couple of things. One, we were very fortunate to take out with the military strike Junaid Hussain, who was the #1 ISIS cyber commander, sending out these directives. But there will be others to follow after him. I think the prevention piece that's been pointed out has been severely overlooked. We spend billions of dollars to both kill terrorists and keep them out of the United States. We spend very little focus on prevention from within, outreach to these communities. Because in most of these cases, like Tamerlan Tsarnaev, a flag's going to go up. He was kicked out of his mosque, the Boston bomber was, for being too radical, and yet that wasn't called to the attention of authorities. I think a lot of this could be stopped by prevention if we have better outreach to these communities. And Ranking Member Thompson and I passed a bill out of committee to combat violent extremism. It needs to be more of a priority and a focus within the administration. And I'll open it up to any other member that would like to respond to that question, if there are any. Okay.
If no, I'd like to follow real quickly with Mr. Hurd.
Sure.
On that, you talked about the back alley piece. So I'm interested in your take on how this adversary has changed since 2000, because that's one of the issues that we've heard a lot about, is that we've been engaging them like they're still stuck in the Al-Qaeda post 9/11 days, when in reality, they're a whole other generation of digital warriors out there, is what I've been told. So I'm interested in your view on the evolution of the threat.
You know, they're not hiding. ISIS is a very new phenomenon from Al Qaeda of the early 2000s, and their ability to reach out to many people, that means they increase their surface area of attack in ways that we can understand their networks. But you can still stop them the same way we stopped Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. In December of 2001. When the fall of Kandahar, in the city in southern Afghanistan, which was the headquarters of the Taliban, we'd killed 2/3 of Al Qaeda leadership, and we pushed out the Taliban out of the entire country. And there were only 400 Americans on the ground. 300 special forces, 100 CIA officers. We were able to accomplish that because of the most, a superior air power that the world had ever seen, and relationships with groups on the ground, Northern Alliance, different Pashtun groups, and that framework exists in Syria, and that's how we should be looking at our strategy on stopping them down there. But we have to counter their message as well. There is a Spanish professor that's now at Georgetown who has highlighted, he's looked at about 800 campaigns that ISIS is using, and they're using imagery from TV shows like Person of Interest, movies like American Sniper, video games like Call of Duty. And when you look at the media that ISIS is producing, it looks almost like these popular images that we've already seen. And we don't have this whole of government effort on countering this violent extremism. And it can't just be the United States. It also has to be our Sunni Arab partners in the region, helping to leverage that message as well. So we're falling down on the messaging game where ISIS is superb.
Thank you. Yes.
You stated that 300,000 foreign fighters have gone into Syria and Iraq.
30,000.
30,000, excuse me. Where did that number come from, and what countries are they mostly coming from?
That's from basically the federal law enforcement numbers, intelligence community. They've developed those numbers. Let me just emphasize, those are the ones that we know about. And you don't know what you don't know. When it comes to the 250 Americans, that's just the ones that we know about, many of whom have returned to the United States, and we're very concerned about that threat as well. They're really coming from all over the world. They're coming out of Europe. They're coming out of Northern Africa. They're coming from Australia. They're coming out of Indonesia. So what you're dealing with is sort of a global jihad phenomenon that we're seeing, these radical Islamists filling the power vacuums left in Northern Africa and the Middle East primarily, and then recruits coming out of Europe. We have a lot of these cyber warriors, for instance, coming out of the UK. Junaid Hussain was a British citizen who traveled to Raqqa, which is where they're operating out of. So I think that's to me, the frightening thing is that the fact it is a global phenomenon, that this is not just confined to the old days of Iraq and Afghanistan. This thing is metastasizing, all over the world now, predominantly in Northern Africa and the Middle East. But we're seeing it spread throughout Europe and Australia, and we don't want to see that spread into the United States. Yes.
You mentioned that at least 40 U.S. fighters have returned back to the U.S. Some have gone back and forth a number of times. Where are they, and what efforts are being made to find them at this stage?
We think about 50 have come back. Look, if we can arrest these individuals, we do. If we, under the Constitution, cannot charge them with a criminal offense or providing material support, we monitor them. But again, if you don't, we don't have good intelligence on the ground in Syria. We don't have good human intelligence. So it's really hard to know who has traveled. I give the FBI and Homeland great credit for stopping a lot of this and arresting almost 70 ISIS followers in the United States. These are astounding numbers, though, and you can only stop it for so long. And if we don't have good human intelligence on the ground to identify who has gone to the battlefield and who has come back, That's a hard threat to stop. And it's hard to prosecute. As a former federal prosecutor, you have to have evidence to charge them. And if we don't have that good human on the battleground to know that they joined the enemy, it's very difficult to prosecute that case. Yep.
So is there anything more transportation security officials can do in addition to what they're already doing, or does the onus rest on intelligence officials and beefing up what we do and don't know?
Well, I think it's common. Good intelligence can stop this. And the intelligence sharing within our partners and European partners is really key to this. TSA has ramped up their security precautions. There was a threat from the Corzine group. We ramped up about 25 different airports around the world. The Istanbul airport is the epicenter, and we traveled to there, the epicenter for the foreign fighter. 40 million people go through that airport per year, and the screening has gotten better. I think for a while they just turned a blind eye because they were fighting Assad, who they don't like. Now they're screening better inbound, but the outbound screening is not where it needs to be, and we're concerned about that outbound, traffic coming out of the region into Western Europe and then possibly the United States. I would argue Europe has a real problem on its hands. Europe is wide open, and until the European Parliament passes new legislation to vet, pass the watch list, they're going to continue to have this problem. Not to mention the Syrian refugee crisis that we're witnessing today. Yeah.
You've talked repeatedly about the need for greater international cooperation. You said, good intelligence we don't really have, no good human intel on the ground. But now we're seeing the Russians moving into Syria, the Russians, the Iranians, Assad regime, the Iraqis all working together on intelligence. Are we talking about potentially working with people we don't particularly like, we don't particularly trust? Is that going to become necessary? They have a lot of intel. They're not our friends. Does that change some of the recommendations in your report at all, since this is sort of fresh?
Well, I think Russia has filled a power vacuum. I think we've had a failed foreign policy and strategy that's led to this in terms of dealing with Assad or dealing with ISIS. So with that vacuum, we have Russia coming in, forming a geopolitical alliance between Iran and Syria, and really calling checkmate, on us. I will say the one thing we have in common with the Russians is our dislike for the terrorists. They have the Chechen rebels. The Boston bomber was a Chechen rebel. They have their Northern Caucasus region, and I think they view that what is happening in the Caliphate, in the Islamic State, is becoming such a great threat, and no strategy is out there to deal with it effectively, that they're stepping into it. And they're also filling the power vacuum. The complication is their obvious support for Assad. And as long as Assad remains in power, he remains a magnet for the jihadists, for the terrorists. I've often said the long-term solution has to be a military and political strategy, but also dealing effectively with Assad. I hope the president, as he visits with Mr. Putin today and to the United Nations, can work out a strategy to effectively work to eliminate the threat of ISIS, but also to find a way to remove Assad from power, whether it be a graceful exile or through other means. But I think that has to be a part of this overall equation. Yeah.
You talk about legislation. I mean, what might that look like?
I think the biggest one is having a national strategy. And I think that's going to be the biggest piece of legislation that we look at. The other is trying to close these security gaps that we see in Europe. But the fact we don't have a strategy, as I mentioned, we have a combating violent extremism bill that I'd like to see come to the floor to deal with this problem on the home front. You got to deal with the problem over there, but you got to deal with it in the homeland as well. And this radicalization over the internet is becoming increasingly a problem. When we went over on our trip to the Middle East and Europe, the big focus was foreign fighters. When we came back, it was, my God, they're radicalizing over the internet, and there are hundreds of thousands of these missives coming out per day to radicalize Americans. It's a very difficult challenge for law enforcement in this country, not to mention, as was indicated earlier, the idea that they can go into dark platforms to communicate. They're very savvy. You know, they get a hook on the internet with someone they're talking to online, and then they go into what's called a dark space, dark platform to communicate, and we can't see those communications even if we have a court order. You can't stop a threat that you can't see. And if they can communicate in darkness, that makes the threat even higher, and we need to be able to shine a light on that darkness. And I think that's another piece of legislation that we'll be looking at, is how can we change that so that we can monitor these communications. If someone in Raqqa, Syria is talking to someone in New York about conducting a terrorist attack, and we can't see that communication, that puts Americans in danger.
I have time for 2 more questions if there are 2.
Have you worked with the administration or discussed with them or other U.S. agencies or entities to talk about where to go from here and how the report's been received?
You know, I know the ranking member and I talked to Lisa Monaco, the Homeland Security Advisor to the President. I think she recognizes the threat level here. I know she's had discussions with Turkey, important NATO ally in this fight against ISIS over there. I believe, as was said earlier, this needs to be a Sunni Arab fight against the Sunni extremists. Under American leadership with our special forces embedded, but it has to be the Sunni Arab. It's their backyard, you know, stepping up to the plate to defeat the Sunni extremists. I think for too long we've carried the water there, and 100,000 U.S. combat. You know, we're the infidel over there, and I don't think there's political appetite for that. But I do think a indigenous force under American leadership and NATO, with our forces embedded, is the best strategy to defeat this threat.
On a similar vein, you talked about a couple pieces of legislation. Where are they, and is there support for passing anything in the Senate as well?
Well, we just came out with this report, and so the next step is to identify the legislative steps necessary, and also dealing with the other key committees. I think, again, this is one of those issues that, as the ranking member indicated, this is about protecting Americans. This should not be a partisan issue. These bills should be able to pass through the House. And the Senate, even given their 60-vote rule, for God's sakes, if we can't pass this kind of legislation, what can we pass in this Congress? And I think the White House would invite this type of legislation. I don't know if Chairman Katko wants to comment any further on the legislative steps.
Yeah, sure. In the report, as you go through it, there's 32 key findings that we have in the report. And those findings are going to be the genesis of the legislation. So if you just look at those findings, you're going to see what we're talking about with legislation in addition to what we've already talked about. If you want some more specifics as to the various federal agencies and federal government officials you spoke to, if you look at page 56 of the report, first appendix, it lists all the different places we briefed with: State Department, FBI, Justice, Homeland Security, all these executive agencies. And we got a lot of input from them as well. So that'll give you a lot of input as well. Okay.
Lastly, how much of an indictment is this against the Obama administration's policy? I mean, the lack of a strategy, as you put it, falls squarely on the White House, on the DOD, or?
Well, I'm not trying to, make a partisan attack. We're just telling the truth. The threat's real. You can try to downplay it, but the threat is real to the homeland. When you look at the numbers, they don't lie. The stats are real. In terms of the numbers of foreign fighters that I've described, tens of thousands of them, many Americans, the internet threat, the radicalization from within, the thousands of followers in the United States, the hundreds of thousands of ISIS directives over the internet per day. I'm very concerned about our security. And so I would hope the President would take this as an opportunity as he meets with our foreign partners and with Mr. Putin to try to resolve this crisis. Because if we don't handle it over there, if we don't address it honestly and call the threat what it is and know that it's a real threat, we're not going to be able to eliminate the threat, and therefore the American people will always be at greater risk. And that's all we're trying to accomplish. We're not trying to throw partisan jabs out. We're just speaking the truth about the threat level and what we think needs to be done to stop that threat, both overseas but also from coming into the United States so they can kill Americans.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.